Lost Private. We're in Normandy.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 13 of the We're Not Lost Private podcast. I'm your host, Joe Muccia. My co-host, Leighton Hughes, is on assignment right now at We Have Ways Fest, and I am not embarrassed to say that I'm a little jealous of him. He's out there. Well, he's probably wrapping up soon because I think they're beginning to shut down. But it's been, from what I understand, a couple, 2.5 days of really fantastic presentations and displays by some really fantastic historians and authors. Speaking of authors, for those of you who've been following the show over the last couple of months, we've had a outstanding string of high quality authors on to talk about their work, and really, to me, they've contributed heavily to new material within the historiography of the battle for Western Europe, specifically in Normandy. And in my mind, our next guest is probably doing more so in that regard than a lot of other authors that are writing about the topically about Normandy. For the longest time, we've had the Zetterling Normandy 1944 book as pretty much our only reference to German units in the Cotentin. Or if you're lucky enough to have access to the German archives, you've been able to go look at that material firsthand. But many of us don't, and many of us don't have a very good command of the German language. But I'm happy to introduce our guest, Niels Henkemans. He is a historian and author. He has just published his part of his defining book set on the German defense of Normandy, and I'm going to bring up on the share screen real quick. But Niels, welcome. Glad to have you here. And there's the cover for 1A. 1B will be coming at some point, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the podcast. But again, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I think, we exchanged a few notes and emails about what we wanted to talk about. But I think for me, one of the most interesting aspects of this all is, how did you get to the point that you wanted to write about this topic and do so at the manner and the depth that you have?
Well, for me, it started probably as a teenager. I've always been interested in history. And then at some point, it became more and more interested in the Second World War, especially Normandy. And you start to look in books in libraries at first, and scale models at toy stores and things like that. And so I very much started to build models as a way for me to connect with history. Other people collect militaria, but I like to build models, not for the technical bits, but more for the stories behind this. And at that same period, you could see forums on the internet starting to pop up, and they were a wonderful collection of very respected historians doing the traditional work in archives. But also you could see several archives and collections starting to digitize their materials. So on these forums, you could start with other volunteers there. You could start to mine these archives that were being digitized. And Normandy became very popular, especially looking into the Germans, the German armor, the panzers in Normandy. And it started to become sort of a research topic, and anyone could participate in that. So as a teenager, I started doing that. And then at some point, I became fascinated by the fact that the Germans were using a lot of captured material. In Normandy, you had captured French tanks that were being used by several formations. And you have the very famous 21st Panzer Division around Caen, which has a lot of different versions, a lot of modifications. But on the Cotentin Peninsula, which is of course well known for the American 5th Corps involvement there, and the 101st Airborne, the 82nd Airborne, the 4th Infantry, 9th Infantry, 79th Infantry, 90th Infantry. In that particular area, there were 2 German tank battalions that had these French tanks. And at first I wanted to build one of those vehicles as a model to see to get a feel for what's going on, how tiny are these things, because they really are tiny. Even if you stand next to a real one, if you think, wow, this is tiny, when you have a Sherman in another corner, let alone a tiger or a panther. But I was became fascinated by these, and I wanted to build an accurate model, and then go to you look online, you go to magazines, well-known other people who have written about this. And the more I was looking into this, I was thinking, I already know this isn't correct, and what is this information based on? And so I started to look into this more and more. And then at some point, I decided to collect everything I had and write a couple of internet articles explaining first these captured panzers on the Cotentin Peninsula, but also starting to expand that. And people were asking, why are you not going to write a book about this? And I thought, well, who am I to write a book about this? I just know a little bit about this small subject. But people kept asking that, and I kept looking into more research and books and gathering information. And then at some point, I thought, well, why wouldn't I write a book? I can at least give it a try. So that's what tried to do. And initially I wanted to write a campaign book, German and American armor on the Cotentin Peninsula, from their perspective, to see what's going on, how they were dealing with the blockage, with all the problems they were facing, how they were supporting other formations. But the more I was doing research and the more I was trying to write, the more it became apparent that it's quite easy. It still takes time, but it's quite easy to get American documents and after action reports. But I was finding very, very little information on the German side. And I wanted to place these armored formations in their context. And I was starting to think, I cannot write about this if I don't know what's going on the German side. So that's pretty much how I decided. If I want to write a campaign book, I first need to understand the formations involved. And that's how I moved towards looking into these particular formations, from independent companies to division size and even up, and trying to read up on this. And it sort of snowballed out of that. So this is sort of a side project in, I don't know how many volumes it will be, but this is a side project from an initial idea to write a campaign book just about armor on the peninsula.
Yeah, it's funny how that side project just became the primary effort, right? And I think, in seeing a lot of your posts on social media, I think even, it's quite daunting for folks who are not, first of all, don't have a command of the German language, and two, are not used to looking at German organizational documents. A number of your posts show how, like, for the U.S. Army, we call it a table of organization and equipment. For the Germans, it's intuitively not set up the same way as the American TO and E's are, and you have to just understanding how to read those correctly is a little bit of a battle at first. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's now second nature, and I can look at these, and most symbols are repeated a lot. So for me, it's quite easy. But there's a few peculiarities if you look at these, because for Germans, they're very nice overviews, but formations are numbered right to left instead of left to right, and that's one of the things people initially think, what's going on here? I don't understand what this is. And the idea behind that was that if you would put it on paper, or you would put it on a parade ground, you would put what's on paper on the parade ground, and you are the commander of a unit, and you look at your unit, your formations, then they look okay from left to right. So that's how it's organized. And people in the medical profession, they're more used to thinking out of bodies, how you look at that, and that's also intuitive for a lot of people. So that's something in these symbols. One of the things I did decide is I could have translated these into NATO symbols or US style of doing this, but I decided, let's go with the original German documents, turn them into a modern version, still with the old symbols, but just to make them look a bit better graphically and more consistent, because German records are not consistent in their use of language and symbols. There's deviations. So that's, for me, I can see where they are, but if you're not familiar and you're looking at two different documents and you start to think, they're doing this in this document, and is this in this other document, are they doing meaning something different? But often it's just to say a different way of showing the same things. So that's why I've included the original pictures basically, but with a very clear organization of explanation of all the symbols.
Yeah, I think for those of us that will rely on your books, I think it's important that you do stay with the original German symbology. One of the things I know from talking to friends who have looked at the German archival documents is that they're, and I don't know if you experienced this, I'm assuming you did, but I mean, I'd love to hear your insights on it. Gaps in the paperwork, like a lot of paperwork didn't survive the war in many cases. How did that affect your research as you move forward with your writing of your book?
Yeah, that's very true, and it's a very significant problem. There was in volume 1A and 1B in my book, I cover 6 infantry divisions that fought on the peninsula, and for none of them there are after action reports available. If you're lucky, you find a few for it, some individual days, sometimes just for my battle group. That's not a lot of information is there. So if you go to the archives and you're expecting for German formation in Normandy to find an after action report and all the divisional records, for an infantry division, you can just forget it, basically. There's a few exceptions, but generally speaking, you will find some documents before the fighting, but once the fighting began, especially with units on the peninsula, most of them were cut off and destroyed in Normandy, or very small remnants survived. But if you may imagine, if you try to survive the Falaise Gap, taking your documents with you is not first priority. So a lot of material, and really a lot of material, has been lost. So and that's one of the reasons I decided to focus on individual formations, heavily on divisions, because even at Army Corps level, the 84th Army Corps that was responsible for much of Normandy throughout the fighting, they don't have records for 1944 left. There's a few individual pages, but that's it. So that's not where you're going to find a lot of answers. And then you can go up, you can go to Army level or Army group level, but if you look at the reports there's only very basic information, because it's not, a lot of information isn't relevant there. So I decided, well, if I can't go up, I need to go down. But even when you go down, you start to realize there's a lot of information from these divisions missing. But divisions are still the place where everything sort of connects. They're the main bodies of the German military. So if you start to focus on gathering information on divisions, things become a bit easier. And you try to collect as much information as possible. And that can be from German records, but also there's a lot of information from captured records. There are prisoners of war interrogations, either in the field in Normandy or in the UK, some even in the United States. And if you combine that with the records, the intelligence records, especially of in this case, the American commands, 5th Corps, 7th Corps, 1st Army, but also 21st Army Group, there is a lot of captured information there. And it's still bits and pieces, so you're trying to combine everything. In most cases, there's generally quite a lot of information from the German side up to the invasion, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you know where every company is. And units that are in Normandy for a long time, you can generally track them. But if they bring a new division, like for instance the 91st Air Landing Division that was holding the center of the peninsula on D-Day, if you look at them, they arrived in the course of May. And there's so many elements arriving that they're not reporting where the companies are, they're just reporting where the battalion headquarters are. So that's the information you have to work with. And then you try to find additional details in either Allied records or prisoner of war interrogations. Sometimes you get lucky with some diaries. But what I tried to do in my book was mainly to step away from personal accounts, as interesting as they are. They're absolutely fascinating, and for me, they're the best way to connect with a unit and with a battle. But I was finding that our understanding of Normandy, the German side of this, is generally so poor that to interpret these accounts, you first need to understand the basic German picture. So that's what I try to do with my books, and also for the general public, interesting on different levels. I know there are war games who find certain things interesting. I know there's people who like more write-off battles. I'm trying to sort of provide something for all of them, and also for fellow historians who can read my books and then at least say, oh wait, I thought this was true, but this shows that it's at least there's a big question mark we need to put there. And that's how I try to rebuild our understanding of the German side of things.
Well, it sounds like you opened up your aperture for more sources to fill those gaps, and you did it the right way. As far as there's a lot of folks out there when they write product or they write pieces about World War II, they write from it's been in vogue for a number of years now to write it from the foxhole view. So it's Uncle Bob or Grandpa Jim who's in the middle of this action, but as somebody who's served in combat, I can tell you right now, their field of view is very narrow. And unless you work in a higher headquarters, you don't necessarily know what's going on above you. And so there's a limited value. The visceral part of that account, the feelings that come with those personal accounts are extraordinary, but they don't tell the grander overall picture. So you need to have a way everything needs to be placed in the hierarchy of the story. And it sounds like you found the perfect mix of it. And I have read the sample information that's available, and the writing is very good. It's very compelling, and it's obviously very detailed. And I think the folks that pick up a copy of Defending Normandy are definitely going to get that out of it. But when we talked before we went on air, we also talked about maybe talking about a couple of the major formations in the Cotentin. So we could kind of talk about things that you found out about them. We also mentioned a bit of myth busting back and forth in our emails, but you mentioned the 91st. So let's lean in with them first, because I think I think it's a very interesting formation. I think the death of its commander on D-Day is some very compelling storytelling in itself. And also one of its major components, the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, is also features heavily in a lot of works that have come out of late. And they seem to be an interesting place to start. So, and you said, and I remember, my research showing that, and you've said this before, they are kind of a late arriver to the story in the defense of the Cotentin.
Yeah, you can see in April and May of 1944, Hitler starts to focus more on Normandy, and he's rushing in reinforcements. There's a training battalion is being moved up. There's another tank. Both these battalions with French tanks are being moved up into the peninsula. And there's also talk about what are we going to do with additional elements, strong elements. Very quickly, they decide to send the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment to Normandy. At that time, the plan is still to send the entire 2nd Fallschirmjäger Division, of which this regiment is part, to Normandy. The problem is that this division is nowhere near ready for action. It's been badly mauled in other theaters. It needs to be reassembled. It needs to be rebuilt quite significantly. And instead, they decide to send the 2nd Fallschirmjäger Division towards Brittany, where it will participate in the fighting for Brest. And instead, the 91st Air Landing Division, which they're first sending to Brittany, gets rerouted towards the peninsula. So that's where they end up in the first, say, 2 weeks of Normandy. They start to, of the start of first 2 weeks of May, they start to arrive there. And as you may imagine, it's always difficult if you're arriving in a new area, especially with a terrain that is with a bocage that's not very familiar to you. You need time to adjust, and you can always make your argument that to what extent was this division prepared for this, but I'll come back to that later. One of the things people get wrong about this division, it's a bit better lately, but in a lot of years people have been suggesting that this is a Luftwaffe division because of its title. It's a Luftlande Infantry Division. But it's not. It was always raised as a general army division, quite a peculiar one, because in January 1944, the Germans decide we need extra divisions, and they come up with what Allied intelligence later calls a pocket infantry division. So instead of 3 regiments, you get 2 regiments, still with 3 battalions each, which is not standard at that time anymore in the German military, because they have reduced their regiments to 2 battalions each. So you get a smaller, as you may imagine, the support elements needed to support 2 regiments are less than you need for 3 regiments. So they're saving on heavy weapons, for instance, heavy weapons companies, but also on artillery.
Now, is this driven due to manpower shortages at that time?
Very much so. And these the Germans are generally looking at what can we do to make our units more efficient. That can include removing spare machine guns, which you can see going on, moving our mortars around from rifle companies to a heavy battalion, to the heavy company in each battalion. But you can see all sorts of things, and these are the German tables of organization and equipment they're using. And you can see these continue to be changed. And by now by 1944, you get another major update that goes into effect in the course of May. And the question is always, to what extent was this implemented and really carried out by divisions fighting in Normandy? And it varies a bit. But you can see a lot of changes in these divisions, and they create 6 of these pocket divisions. 5 of them end up fighting in Normandy, so that's quite significant. And the first one to arrive, of the first 2 actually, the first one is the 91st, is in Normandy at the time, and the other one I cover in my book, volume 1A, is the 77th, which also which is coming up from the Mont Saint-Michel area, which a lot of people have been to Normandy, have also visited that place. So
would you categorize the 91st as a hard luck division? I mean, they really get battered pretty badly, don't they?
Yeah, but every German division in Normandy gets battered pretty badly. So
good point.
Yeah, but you could say what one of their problems is that they have arrived. I mean, these are created from a reinforced regiment that was existing in Germany, and they're formed in January 1944. So there's not a whole lot of time of training, and just compare that to our Allied divisions, quite a lot of American divisions that never participated in other operations before Overlord. 101st Airborne, of course, very well trained, no real experience, but very well trained for a long time. 4th Infantry Division, 29th, all of these are divisions that they're very formidable in training. And this German division it's in itself is a new division, so there's all problems associated with that. And then you get transported into Normandy, onto the peninsula, and of course that's very difficult terrain. And people often look at the bocage and say, well, it's a dream for a defender. It's true, but when you're the Germans and you're being outnumbered and you have a limited amount of weapons, it's often easier to be able to use sweeping machine gun fire to cover an entire area, and you cannot do that in the bocage. You also have no spotter planes that you can use to see Allied approaches. So an Allied assault can be on top of you before you know it. Sound gets muffled. And to deal with that, General Marshall, commander of the 84th Army Corps, when he's still in Brittany, where there's also bocage, he writes a document explaining how he thinks you should fight in bocage area. And it's still the only German example I've seen of this kind of doctrine, and it's still coming from General Marx, and he emphasizes aggression and initiative. And you may imagine that airborne troops are very good at initiative. They'll go look for the enemy, they will deal with the enemy, but a regular division will have much more trouble with that. And that's also something I think you can see in the 91st Airlanding Division. If you look at the fighting around east of Saint-Côme-du-Mont, there's Allied American reports from the 101st Airborne especially, where they say, well, there was very hard fighting by the Germans, but they failed to take the initiative and come out of their foxholes. They were very well dug in when we landed, and that's when we were very vulnerable, but they were unable to take advantage of that. And there's also talk from General Gavin, who says, well, the Germans had their plans on how to deal with this, but if you want to attack and coordinate with your artillery, you need to do that very well in the bocage. And he said He collected, when he was in Normandy, he collected German reports and records and complaints where the Germans were saying, well, we cannot support our infantry with artillery because we don't know where they are.
Yeah, I
And
was
there's
going to
also,
say, it sounds like one of the major difficulties for them in their command and control is their communications. Um, they lack a lot of wireless sets. That's correct? Which would help with the coordination of that supporting fire and not only that, reporting up and down. To me,
yeah, it's very,
that's a recipe for disaster for a fighting unit.
yeah, so they ultimately they cannot use a lot of their support. And what's also interesting is that the way it becomes worse in the way they try to organize their forces, this division. Because what this division does, it builds battle groups. Usually these are reinforced infantry battalions, and these get an artillery battery stationed in their sector, and they are sort of to dig in them and all around defenses, and then be able to strike from there. But if you, as you can imagine, if everybody is dug in and you need to come out and you need to assemble your troops, that's going to take time. And if you have only one artillery battery available, that you might be able to coordinate the fire of that battery. But if you need reinforcements from other sectors, how are you going to coordinate that? So there's no general German artillery reserve available to this division, except for 2 battalions that are further west, and they are being brought up on D-Day. And even then, that's one of the batteries gets pretty much slaughtered as they move towards the front. They get ambushed and badly shot up. So we can see the difficulties the Germans have in trying to coordinate this, and that's especially true, I would say, for the 91st Air Landing Division, because they need to react immediately. And other units coming from farther away, they have time to move up and try to organize and learn from the first experiences. But the 91st Air Landing Division, being in the center of the peninsula, they go into action immediately. Airborne troops land on top of them, and they need to deal with that. So there is no time to coordinate and assess. And then, of course, their commanding general gets killed on D-Day, which might not be important for the initial response, but if you want to start to adjust to the things that are happening, and you need to deviate from your conceptions before the invasions and what you were thinking was going to happen, then it's very helpful to have a general who knows what he's doing and saying, okay, this is what we plan to do, but the situation is different, and now let's do this.
Not to mention the role of his headquarters in coordinating with the other friendly German units around to inform them of what's going on in his battle space, so that they're aware. They might need to reinforce his division, or or he may be able to reinforce their division. Without that level of control at the tactical level, you're right. He's going to have less of an impact on that fight, on that very small level fight. But at the higher level, where coordination needs to happen between multiple units and multiple supporting elements, without his headquarters, without him there to decipher that and to issue orders, it really hamstrings them. I do think like 6FJ is fairly lucky, and they have Van der Heiter as the commander, and he's a very aggressive commander, and he leads from the front. But I think that his aggressiveness may have cost him one or maybe even 2 full battalions of his troops and the way he deployed them. And feel free to disagree with that. That is just my opinion.
No, I do agree on with that. And what you can see is this Valsjemjäger regiment, they also get jumped in the dark, and they respond to that, and they need to figure out what's going on. And they're not in contact with the divisional headquarters, because they're at this time they are subordinated to the 91st Air Landing Division, but they're not able to communicate with them. And Von der Heide ultimately gets his orders in the course of the morning from General Marx, the Army Corps commander. And then he decides to, one of his battalions is busy cleaning the rear area from paratroopers that landed in that area, mostly strays. It's trying to deal with that, and 2 battalions start moving up towards Saint-Côme-du-Mont. And then you can see indeed that he's doing what, well, the idea is, how do you deal with enemy air landings is by being aggressive. But at that particular time, you could argue that there's so much time has already passed that it's no longer the time to be that aggressive. And you can see him moving up to He sends one battalion towards the coast, towards Saint-Marie-du-Mont, 1st Battalion, which gets destroyed there the next day. And a lot of people have focused on von der Heydte's account from after the war, suggesting that he sent the other battalion towards Saint-Mary-Glise. And that's not true. If you look at the after-action report from this particular regiment, you can see that he sends the other battalion towards Heesville, and that's much closer. And that also makes more sense because then you have 2 battalions that can sort of mutually support each other. So he's aiming both battalions basically towards the front or towards the coast. There's still a distance between them, and that's also gets exploited by troops from the 101st. But it's not like he's sending them completely in different directions, one north and one northeast. They're both sort of going northeast. So that particular bit I wouldn't call overstretch, but it's arguably too aggressive and also a bit bad luck ultimately when their 1st Battalion is too far forward, too close to Saint-Marie-du-Mont, and it's being cut off by the 506th, which is moving south on the morning of the 7th.
Yeah, I think you and I discussed this probably a couple of years ago, prior to both of us did shows with Woody on World War II TV, and I did my Veerville show, and you did your Dead Man's Corner one. Basically, we did them back to back, and you and I discussed the deployment of his troops and then how they're destroyed. And by the time they're done, he's only got the 1 battalion left, and basically that's, if memory serves, that's what basically it's pulled back to provide that rear guard force in Carentan before as they're essentially falling back as the 101st starts advancing with the 4th Infantry Division and the independent tank units that are coming ashore. But yeah, they're I would say calling them a hard luck division in my mind is probably a pretty accurate. Like you said, they arrive a new unit that has not worked together very much prior to deploying to the Cotentin. They have significant command and control issues. They have some significant deficits in supporting weapons, and they end up paying for it fairly quickly. But we also talked about the other 2 major units that I wanted to get your rundown of, the 352nd and the 709th. I think the 352nd, everybody is aware of their role in the defense, especially on D-Day. But would you care to weigh in on them and their performance? I know there's a lot of myths about, you always hear people talking about, oh, they're too old and they're overweight, or they're too young, and your previous appearances on other shows like Woody's, you discuss some of those inaccuracies. But would you care to weigh in on the 352nd and some of that stuff?
Yeah, sure. I intend to cover the 352nd in one of the future volumes of my books. I'm going to do more about the Calvados, the part east of Carentan, basically towards the Seine. But
so we're getting a preview. What you're telling me, we're getting a preview of
1B.
Yeah,
there's a bit of this on Twitter already, because it's not a priority division, so I'm a bit more for me. So it's a bit more easy to share information about this.
Oh, great.
But generally speaking, what you hear a lot is what you can see a lot of when it comes to German formations is they're being used in the way someone wants to tell a story. So if you want to say the Americans were up against an incredible, powerful enemy at Omaha Beach, you say the 352nd Infantry Division is a very powerful, experienced veteran division just in from the Eastern Front. If you want to say the Germans were not very good at waging war at this time, they were very unprofessional and they were very bad at logistics, you say this division is poor and they didn't have things organized because it reflects German military in general. But most of these stories, the way they're being told, this division is being described, is aimed at telling the Allied perspective, the story how you want to tell about the Allies. And what I try to do, and that's one of the main reasons for writing my books, is I want to go back to the German side of things and look, what of this is really true? And what can we prove, what don't we know? But what's their side of the story? And more focus on them and not as a tool to tell a story. And if you would look at the 352nd Division, a few things that aren't true. It's not an elite division coming straight in from the Eastern Front. That's absolutely nonsense. This division was raised in Normandy. I'm very polite. This division was raised starting basically September 1943 in Normandy itself. Yes, it was absorbed elements from a division that already existed. Some already had fought on the Eastern Front, but this division hadn't seen action before D-Day. So that's one thing I think it's important to realize. So no, not an elite unit coming in from the Eastern Front. Although you would always have to ask how strong are units coming in from the Eastern Front, because when you're sent to France, you're pretty much worn out and you're there for rest and refit. But this division had considerable time to form in Normandy. It was called Battle Group Normandy, just as another division in the West was called Battle Group Brittany, and another division was called Battle Group Channel Coast. And all three of these developed into actual infantry divisions. So there was considerable time for this division to form up, and it was formed according to the latest German ideas on how to organize a division. So a new type infantry division, that's 6 infantry battalions plus a fusilier. That's sort of another additional infantry battalion, so 7 infantry battalions, and no longer 9 or 9.5, 10, depending on how you look at it, which was during early war situation. And this division has time to grow, time to develop. And if you start looking, the Allies were also curious. What did we encounter after they had landed? And first, what are they doing here? I'll come back to that one later. But they started looking at analyzing information about the German personnel. And they found that about 50% of this division, frontline troops that they collected paybooks of, had experience from either the Eastern Front or from North Africa. So there is definitely experience in this division. Then it's still difficult to assess what is experience from the Eastern Front. Are these guys who have been serving well behind the front in support roles and are now being upgraded to frontline infantry? Because that's a little different than actually fighting on the Eastern Front at the front line. So that's not something you can find easily in the Allied records. So that's a question I'm still working on. But you can clearly see there is information about what are these guys. And also when you start looking at how old are these guys, generally you get a picture of 1/3 is under 20, and about 1/3 is over 30, 35, and the rest is sort of in the middle. So it's sort of evenly distributed. And that's also what brings us to a lot of myths that you hear about lots of divisions in Normandy. Yeah, they were all very old. Average age of a static division was 36, which we can prove it wasn't. But these are the stories you hear a lot. And if you go back to Allied records about this is intelligence, because the Allies wanted to know what are we up against. And by trying to analyze manpower and age groups, you can also see, you can deduce the German losses. If you know so many percent of the frontline troops are of this particular year of birth, and we know Germany should have this percentage, and there's differences there, you can say, oh, those are probably losses. So Allied intelligence was very interested in the demographics of the German forces, which brings us to another point, and that's the amount of non-Germans in these divisions. And you can see here a lot of stories about this. Often German officers themselves who have exaggerated this, and when you start looking into prisoner of war records, where you can actually expect foreign troops to be overrepresented because they're more likely to surrender. I think that's generally a fair assumption. That's not the picture you get, and the percentages are far lower than you are led to believe by people who have a vested interest or had a vested interest in this at a time. But also stories that have been repeated by lots of authors since. A lot of information that what we think we know about the Germans in Normandy is based on personal accounts from key German officers, part of the foreign military studies, which are very interesting, but also just the opinions and the story how these officers wanted to tell it. And
yeah, I was going to mention that because obviously these officers have a bit of an agenda in telling the story a certain way. And I think that that's colored a lot of the narratives of the people who have used those versions of the stories. But you know, I think your book will properly frame those things. even a lousy division with good positions and good fields of fire can inflict a lot of casualties. And I think we obviously see that. And I wouldn't say would you say they were 352nd was an average unit or a below average or an above average? To me, it sounds like they are maybe slightly below average, but they are in static defense. They don't have to do complicated maneuvers. They don't have to do a lot of coordination other than their own fire support and then with their higher headquarters. I mean, there's not a lot of, when you're a static division, you're not expected to make a lot of, grand sweeping movements across the battlefield, which are really end up being the difficult challenges for a command and control element, whereas they're stationary. Does that resonate with your research? Or, I mean, again, if I'm wrong, please educate, because that's what the goal of this is, to educate folks on the German units that are facing the Americans and the Allied forces.
Yeah. Well, the first thing to realize is that the 352nd is a regular German infantry division. It's not a static infantry division. And that means that this division is fully armed with the latest German weapons. It's got the regular German 105mm light howitzers, the regular 15cm heavy howitzers. Its frontline troops are all equipped with MG42s. It has sufficient artillery, infantry guns, light and heavy artillery infantry guns. This is a well-equipped division with ample time for training. So this is, when it comes to infantry divisions in Normandy, this is one of the best you can expect. And if you look at probably at this time in the entire German army, except for divisions that had experience more recently and were still up to strength and fully equipped and everything, this is probably the best kind of German infantry division you can find at the time in mid-1944. But this is a very good division. What we shouldn't forget, on the other hand, is that only one regiment, more accurate, only one battalion, reinforced battalion, was stationed behind Omaha Beach. There was one further to the east. One of these battalions, one regiment, was defending pretty much the Vier estuary on eastern part of Carentan, and there was one regiment, reinforced regiment, in reserve. So that was a mobile reserve with additional mobility. But if the troops on the coast, yes, they were in static duty at the time, but originally this is a division that's considered fully mobile. And what's a fully mobile German infantry division? A division that can move itself, either on foot, because a lot of the troops just had to walk, or horse-drawn, because all the artillery was horse-drawn. There's some motorization, certain elements, but yeah, general idea is your German mobile division if you are able to move yourself. And a static division cannot move in one go, but a regular German infantry division considered mobile can move in one go. And these particular divisions in Normandy received additional forms of mobility. That can be additional bicycles, additional horses, additional motorization. And that was a program you can see a lot in 1943 and 1944, when the Germans are trying to increase the mobility of their troops. So generally speaking, I would say the 352nd Infantry Division is one of the best German infantry divisions in Normandy. Also, one of the reasons it was very the losses on Omaha were so significant is because there was artillery further inland, and that would have been so they knew where they were fighting, how the elevation, the sectors, and if you have functioning landlines or ideally even also radio transmissions, you can call supporting fire very quickly, and that's indeed what, of course, with accounts from people with the Severlo story, which, despite all its holes in that and problems with that account, what we do have there is a member of an artillery regiment being at Omaha because his commander is there to call in the artillery strikes. Yep. So you can see that, and that's one of the most powerful things that they have available. A problem they're having is, of course, ammunition, both for the artillery and for the machine guns. So that's one of the main things. They wanted to have a certain amount, and they were nowhere near that. So that limits your effectiveness, and also once the crust is broken, there isn't a second line where you can regroup, and it's sort of you start to pull back. And that's why this division has a lot of losses in the first weeks, and then it only is able to defend the Senlo front because it gets very significant reinforcements from battle groups from other divisions.
Well, I think you pretty much set the record straight for 352nd, and thank you for doing that. You want to move on to the 709th and talk about them briefly? I know we're
Sure.
coming up on time, and I don't want to hold you any longer than we already have, but definitely wanted to discuss them before we end our time here.
Yeah, sure. I can always come back to these things you find interesting.
Sure.
So the 709th Infantry Division, this will be covered in 1B. That's an interesting division. It's originally raised as a occupational division, has only 2 regiments, still with 3 battalions. And then you can see in the course of the war, they change it towards a coastal defense static division. And they do reinforce it because they realize we need to put some more troops on the peninsula. So in October 1943, it gets an additional infantry regiment. And but at the same time, it also at that period they give up one of their German battalions and they get Eastern battalions in return. So you end up with a division that has German troops, but also Georgians especially, and there's one battalion with Russians. And the Georgians are, of course, known because they were at Utah Beach, or just behind Utah Beach. And this is an interesting division, very much a model of a lot of German static divisions, in that it's very unusual. There's a lot of things that are not standard in this division. Weaponry isn't standard, still mostly German. Even a division like this doesn't have MG42s as much, but still has MG34s. So there are captured machine guns on the Atlantic Wall, but those are considered static weapons. And that's weapons that belong to the sector and are sort of additional weaponry, and not the actual weaponry of this division. And what you can see in this division is also it has the reputation of being having an average age of 36, and that's just not true. What is true is that it does have a lot of older troops and a lot of younger troops, but it's not the average. It doesn't get there. And it's important because 36 is problematic if you start to think about this. And in these divisions, they wanted to have 20% born in 1925 and 1926. So you're talking about 17, 18, 19-year-olds. And if you have 20% of those, say average 18 years old, and you want to get to an average in your division of 36, you need to get a lot of very, very old soldiers. And that's just not how the German military works. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily very well trained or very physically fit, because there's German categories in the quality of manpower, and that's less indeed in these divisions. But there's a lot of young troops moving in. And what you can also see is that towards the starting basically in late 1943, when Hitler issues his Directive 51, they say we need to prioritize the West. And that also bringing in experienced officers, because the officers so far in the West, in these divisions, they're poor, inexperienced, or severe physical limitations. But in the course of late 1943, you can start them bringing up officers. And you can even see 7th Army say personal situation is fully satisfactory, especially compared to what they were used to, but still, you can see things change there. And on D-Day, you can see that Utah Beach is still only defended by pretty much 1 battalion. So there is not a whole lot there. And there's some battalions have been further north that are reserve battalions. They have received additional mobility. But generally speaking, this is an old division, but with a lot of changes, with youngsters coming in, often replacing other 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds, 22-year-olds being sent to the Eastern Front, and now they're being replaced by these. So it's not necessarily that your balance of your division is getting a whole lot better. You could even argue the opposite, but you do have young troops that you can use for a variety of functions. And you can see these there's different replacements of reserve battalions that are being brought in very quickly after D-Day. But it's not like you're facing the full division on D-Day. It's just basically 1 battalion, elements of a 2nd further north. You have the Georgians as a sort of a 3rd battalion, you could say, and then they start to bring in reinforcements. And that's basically the defense supported by yet another division, the 243rd, where the Germans are trying to hold the Americans back from reaching Cherbourg. And they're trying to block the march north. And the 709th is coordinating that entire effort. They're using a regimental commander who's in charge of everything. And there's very interesting foreign military studies, but also secret recordings where their officers are blaming each other. Very entertaining to read. And that gives a very interesting perspective. And you can see their friends, officers that are friends from one another, that they support their views of a particular other officer, and then the other officer has other friends and they blame the other guys. So that's always interesting.
It sounds as though it's almost as if the 709th is like a complete opposite of the 352nd in terms of quality and table of organization and equipment. Whereas the 352nd, as you said, was a very, very good German division, manned properly, a correctly manned and a regular army infantry division, whereas almost like the 709s kind of slapped together a bit, and then they staple on all these captured weapons on top of the German standard weapons that they would have. It sounds like they're almost polar opposites in terms of quality. Does that sound right?
Yeah, the 352nd is, I would say, one of the most predictable divisions in their organization and weaponry. And the 709th is one of those divisions, like a lot of static divisions, you really need to look into because you don't know what to expect really. And that also reflects in their performance. And this is a division, like I said, it gets drawn into battle gradually. And the 352nd, despite all its qualities and all the advantages it has, and being able spend a lot of time inland before moving towards the coast in March 1944. So they did have time in the winter to train. So they have a lot of things in their advantage. But you can also see that 352nd starts getting overrun when they're unable to, when they run out of ammunition. And their withdrawal towards Sanlo is also one that's where they suffer very heavy casualties because they're not able to coordinate their withdrawal as well as they want because they're being overrun by the American advance. And you can stand and fight at certain places, and they do try to pull back and to reorganize things. But you can see them losing a lot of artillery, or artillery ending up in the wrong sector and then being having to be sent back. So there's all sort of complicating factors for a division like that. And in general, the main weakness in Germany, I would say Normandy, is that they never have the initiative.
Yeah, I think the two things also would contribute to that would be, while you talked about their mobility, we tend to think, especially Americans tend to think mobility in the way we review an American unit being mobile, whereas the German army not nearly as motorized / mechanized as the U.S. Army or our allies, because we were supplying them with a lot of mobility as well, but also the control of the air. As these German units are pulling back, they're being mauled because the Luftwaffe is non-existent for the most part. And I think the veterans of North Africa know what it's like to be under that kind of air attack, be subject to that. And I think that, but they have to learn a lot of these lessons again about how to move during the daytime, how to camouflage yourself properly. And I think they learn those lessons the hard way, and they end up suffering heavily from it, like you said, in the pullback to Saint-Lô. But Niels, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about defending Normandy. I cannot wait to get it in my hands. I ordered my copy the other day. I'm still waiting for it. Your book is available through Panzerex, correct? On
Yes.
that side of the pond, and on our side, it's through RMZ books. You can find them online. Are you going to be making any other appearances anywhere? Are you going to be doing some signings at some point?
Nothing planned at this particular stage, but I'm not sure about next summer. I'm quite likely I'll be somewhere in Normandy in June. Other than that, it's a bit too soon to say, but I'm always open to that.
Yeah. Well, you're not sitting on your laurels, right? So how long until we see 1B?
It's scheduled for November. It's been fully written,
fantastic.
so it's a matter of layout and photos and things like that.
Oh, and I know you were going through some stress getting all that stuff ready with 1A from your social media posts. It is a bit of a hectic process to go through and then have your book edited and all of that. the formatting, all of it tends to wear on an author. I don't think people understand the kind of stress you're under when your publisher comes back to you and says, hey, you need to edit, so many pages out, or you have to trim down your reference section. These are the author struggles that I don't think people understand very well. And I empathize with you, having read a lot of your social media posts about dealing with that aspect of publishing the book, but I can't wait to get it in my hands. Again, I'll post all the links for Panzer Rex and for RMZ for our viewers and listeners. We are on Patreon for $3 a month. You get access to all of our material, including our sporadic newsletter, behind the scenes stuff, and trip reports. Hopefully we'll get Leighton on to do a trip report about We Have Ways Fest. You can also find us on YouTube, on Spotify, and Buzzsprout with We're Not Lost Private Podcast. Niels, thank you so much again for coming on, my friend.
My pleasure.
Take care, everyone.